Welcome to the Elixir podcast, where we ask people from all walks of life and from around the world what their favourite poem is and why it's important to them, why or how it speaks to their heart. If you have a poem that you would like to share and would like to appear on the podcast, please contact me at helenwing@me.com.
是善能
In work, satisfactory is ability.
动善时
In action, satisfactory is
夫
time.
为不争
He alone does not contend, hence
故无有
there is no blame.
Hello and welcome again to the Elixir podcast, where we ask people if they have a poem or two poems even that mean something to them personally. And we ask them to read it to us, and then we ask them what it means to them. Today we're going to be talking to Vivienne, who is currently living in France, but has lived in Britain and China variously all her life. Hello, Vivienne.
Hi, Helen. Thank you for asking me to read my poems.
It's an absolute pleasure. What are you going to read to us today?
The first poem I want to read to you is from the Lao-Tzu, and people generally say that's written by Master Lao, but actually it's probably written by lots of different people and edited over time. But it meant a great deal to me as I was learning things about China. And I'll talk more about that later. But the Lao-Tzu, this is chapter 8 from the Lao-Tzu, and it's famously a Daoist text.
Fantastic. Okay.
So chapter 8, highest good is like water. Water benefits all things and does not contend, dwells in places the multitude loathe. Therefore it is somewhat like the way. In being satisfactory is earthy. In intention, satisfactory is depth and benevolence. In speech, satisfactory is truth. In honesty, satisfactory is order. In work, satisfactory is ability. In action, satisfactory is time. He alone does not contend, hence there is no blame.
Oh, okay. So you came to Chinese having been brought up in Britain. How old were you when you first encountered this?
I suppose I was just reaching teenage years. So I was in that kind of critical early puberty.
Yeah.
Mid-puberty, maybe, 12, 13, that kind of age. And I had known nothing much about China, except that some of my relatives were Chinese. And I knew a lot about Chinese food because we ate in restaurants all the time. But I had one uncle who would come every year from New York, and he was a teacher of Chinese. And he would always tell me about Chinese philosophy. So once a year in the summer, I had this sort of immersion in things Chinese. But to be honest, my interest at that age in Asian philosophy, Asian things was not from my Chinese background. My interest might have come from my Chinese background, but the actual process through which I learned it was through all the hippies I was hanging out with. So
yeah, it was very popular, wasn't it? I remember that's how I came to read it when I was going through my hippie era.
Drug, sex, rock and roll, and the Tao.
Exactly, and it just seemed so different and, if you like, unearthly, so different to the world that I was living in at that time. And I guess for you as well, it must have given you a glimpse of something else, if you like.
Yeah, something other, something different, something amazing, and incomprehensible in a way, but also very, very attractive because of sort of archetypal things like, with this particular poem, water is the highest good because it does not contend. It's part of a larger philosophy about how being female is better. And and that resonated with a lot of things that were going on at the time. And so the text is a composite text. It's not written in one voice. So, but in some ways that makes it more important because it reflects a generalized understanding of the world, which was pretty much against the sorts of military conflict and power mongering that was happening at the time it was written, in praise of a politics which is gentler, more female.
Do you feel that there is a strong strain of, if you like, a feminine voice in Chinese poetry?
It eulogizes the feminine voice, definitely. And there is definitely philosophies which glorify sort of passivity. And in this case, water, the whole point of this poem is that water takes the shape of anything that it encounters. It doesn't fight. It just flows through it and around it. It seeks the lowest position, so therefore it's humble. It's totally anti the power politics that was actually the reality of China at the time that it was written. And it's beautiful for that because it also says, well, that is the most powerful thing that can be, water as an element, as we know from tsunami, for example, or floods or whatever, wears away stone. And that's the understanding. And of course, to be honest, at that time, despite my Asian background, I was doing Tai Chi, but learning from Australian opera singers and Europeans of one shape or another. And it was a long time before I went to China and studied original texts, but that was how I encountered this world. And so it meant something to me, not only through the ideas, but also through the embodied movement that I was, the embodiment of these philosophies. So, Tai Chi being famously this, well, it's not particularly soft, actually, when you know how to manipulate the chi, but it is, in theory, you are not taking an aggressive position when you're fighting.
When you came across this text and started learning about Taoism and yin and yang and so on, did that represent for you some sort of liberation from these, what were still are very, if you like, patriarchal structures that society lives under? As you said, if it was written at a time of, warring states and people fighting all of the time, that maybe that was something also in your own life that this represented, oh, there is a way for me. There is something that I can be that isn't everything I find distasteful or don't like. Or was it not as visceral as that?
Well, as I was saying, I was, one of the things that has been probably one of the greatest resources in the whole of my life is the martial arts, and particularly Tai Chi Chuan, which I still do, not as much as I'd like to, but I intend to do every day anyway. But I have embodied that practice, and I use the breath and the movement every day in my general movement. And so I think that it was certainly. I mean, I'm not saying my father was the gentlest man alive, and so there was quite a lot of violence in my youth, actually, on the street, in between pupils, and a lot of racism in my life, one way or another. I encountered street violence on account of living with Ghanaian people, and grew up fighting. So, I suppose, but I didn't really experience that as the patriarchy. That wasn't how I experienced it. But certainly I was drawn to the martial arts and to the gentleness, the strength that one could find through round movements and through not contesting and not fighting. And I suppose walking through a world, those years, I'm sure you remember those years were years when there was a lot of male violence against women.
Mm.
And I suppose I met it hitching. I met it. I met it on public transport. I met it in lots of different ways, and it was a resource in times of hardship. Yes, and hardship where violence was involved. So both in terms of the way I fight, and in the way I walk, and in the way I walk through the world.
Yeah. And the way you breathe and connect with physical
Yeah,
reality, right? Yeah.
yeah, and that's the other thing, of course. The world, the environment, the I got a lot of power from the breath, and the breath is something that associates me with here in the south of France with the hills and the water and the horses and the dogs.
And
So
and being grounded. And also you
mm,
don't have to run the gauntlet of being reported to the police for using your sword in Tai Chi like you were in London. Do you
oh,
remember that time when the police came and you were practicing Tai Chi in the park and someone had said, "There's a woman with a sword"?
I was in Kentish Town. I was expecting some kind of knife gang kids. Were what the police were coming for, but they it was hightailing directly towards me. Put my sword in a tree at the time, and yeah, it was bizarre. But anyway,
Bit of a culture clash.
上善若水，水善利万物而不争，处众人之所恶，故几于道。居善地，心善渊，与善人，言善信，正善治，事善能，动善时，夫唯不争，故无尤。
That was really amazing, Vivienne. So you mentioned to me before that you also have another poem which seems
if I
different,
could.
although is it equally ancient, the next one you're going to do?
Slightly less ancient, but we're talking about decades, maybe a century at most. So let me read the chapter from the Zhuangzi that again was very important to me. And this is about death, really. So this is known as the butterfly dream. And it's that famous that you can find it on Wiki, as you can find the last poem too. And so I've not really chosen anything very unusual. These are important Taoist texts. They weren't Taoist when they were written because there was no such thing as Taoism when they were written, but they became adopted into the Taoist world and became very important. This is popularly known as the butterfly dream. Once, Zhangzi dreamed he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering about, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know that he was Zhuangzhou. Suddenly he woke up, and there he was, solid and unmistakable Zhuangzhou. But he didn't know if he was Zhuangzhou who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that he was Zhuangzhou. Between Zhuangzhou and the butterfly, there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things.
Wow. Okay. So why do you think that's about death? That was a very interesting statement you made.
Well, I read it at my father's funeral in Chinese, probably rather badly, but it's generally thought of as a parable about the nature of being, about the nature of your identity. And in that sense, it talks about the transformation of things from one being to another, from this world to other worlds. And it does so without emotional grief. It's really about the multiverse, I suppose, and how one can slip from one place to another. And the reason why I chose to read it at my father's funeral, which was a very important moment in my life in St. Martin's in the Field, which is the Chinese church in London, was because it was Chinese, because it was something that meant something to me. In other places, Zhuangzi talks about when his wife died, everybody criticized him because he's sitting there beating a drum and singing outside his house.
Mhm.
And it's in a sense about detachment from emotion in order to face some of the most critical moments in our lives and deaths. Um, and so Zhuangzi doesn't quite know really that he's also a butterfly and that he could be somewhere else, or maybe he does have a sense of that, and that's why it's important that we can draw resources from inside of ourselves when we have to go through major transformations in our lives and deaths, and maybe that's just the way it is, and we can be happy and strong with that. And so, yes, Zhuangzi generally challenges our the nature of our being in the world, and gave me strength to deal with all the traumas.
And accept them, actually. I mean, it seems like a poem about acceptance.
Yeah, yeah. That you don't have to cling on to life. You don't have to feel that. And I think more and more when we find it so hard to die,
Mm. Mm.
you don't have to die because people keep us alive.
Yeah.
And um, just the fear that is instilled in us about death is something extraordinary, really. That because we have the sense that we're immortal, and I think that also Zhuangzi is the poet of transcendence, and this story, this parable, is really about transcending life, and that's not about living forever, because
Mhm.
in ancient China you didn't live that long. Unless you're really wealthy, and even so, the really wealthy ate too much, so they died young too. So Zhuangzi's stories, his parables, are about being able to transform into mythical beings, and sort of evoke the immortals who were very real, um, they were reality in the ancient world for Chinese. So the idea that one can live with the possibility of an immortality which involves death is something important to me, I think.
That you're transforming into something else, maybe even
Mm.
something better, right? So,
Like a butterfly lives for a moment.
I also feel that, it's the one thing that has come with age for me is having witnessed the passing of several people that I adored and loved, and being amazingly okay with their passing, actually. Feeling that actually what was going on was entirely natural and entirely right at that particular time, and witnessing their peace with it, actually. And so, I mean, I may be deluding myself, but death no longer seems like something really scary. Actually, I was never as scared of death as I was of madness, but but both of those things I'm less scared of now. I think of them as opportunities rather than condemnations. But that is something that I think we don't, in British culture, we don't really take seriously. I think one of the big flaws, if you like, in our culture here on this little island, is that we have forgotten all of our death rituals and understandings of death, and our ways of processing death. It tends to be nowadays a really isolating experience for whoever's going through either dying or witnessing someone they love dying. And I
It's
think,
very interesting that in modern Chinese culture, it's similar, that there is very little education, death education, for example, and people are not happy with the concept of death. However, the Zhuangzi is an echo from a very distant past about the possibility of transcending the fear of death. I think for Chinese, there is an equally strong history of the imagination that one can actually physically live forever. And you see that in the tombs that people created.
Mm-hmm.
Environments in tombs which were mirroring the worldly environments.
Mm-hmm.
And the corpse was embalmed. So they did, in fact, last for thousands of years, and we dig them up now.
习者庄周梦为蝴蝶，栩栩然蝴蝶也。自喻是至语，不知周也。俄然觉，则衢衢然周也。不知周之梦为蝴蝶语，蝴蝶之梦为周语。周与蝴蝶，则必有分矣。此之谓物化。
There is this counterculture in China whereby one is seeking for something much more transcendent and, in a sense, spiritual, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it's that which has inspired so many of us in Europe and America to follow the sort of esoteric traditions. And they've been an enormous resource for people. They really have. And, you know, all the passion for Qigong or even just the yogic traditions really evokes this kind of transcendence that the Asian philosophies offer to us, really.
Yeah. No, I totally understand. I mean, I totally get that. I think it's wonderful. And in fact, people have started practicing Qigong on the Hackney Downs.
Sure they have. And so they should do. I've been practicing in London parks all my life since I was
it's caught
12
on.
or 13 years old. So this
It's
is why.
caught on. So there you go.
Good.
Vivienne, thank you so much for talking to us about these two amazing poems. And for our listeners, I will be posting these poems in the link on our podcast description to my website, helenwing.com. And so you'll have time to peruse them and think about them and enjoy them as well. Vivienne, thank you so much for
my pleasure
of your time and the openness of your heart. It's been amazing to talk to you.
Thank you, Helen.
If you're a regular listener and are enjoying the podcast, it would mean the world to me if you could hit the follow button on your podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review and a 5-star rating. It helps us tremendously to reach more and more listeners who could also be touched by a guest's poems. That's hit follow, leave a review, and not 4, but a 5-star rating. This would give us just a little help that will make a great deal of difference. Remember, you can find the poems that feature in each episode on my website, helenwing.com. Thanks for listening.